What if you could make a campaign where it was impossible to go off the rails? And this is a trick from back in the day, and so some of you might already know this. Uh, one, if there's no rails, it can't go off it, but I like to do hex crawl campaigns because no matter where the players go, something is happening there. As opposed to a campaign where you have, well, first A is going to happen, and then B is going to happen, which will inevitably lead to C, and then the players go right to Y. What do you do? With a hex crawl campaign, you don't really have that problem. What you're doing with a hex crawl campaign is you're not really creating a plot, per se, like you would in like a book or whatnot, or like perhaps in the campaigns you're used to. Now that doesn't mean there's not a story, however. The story is told in a very different way. The story is told like geographically. And what you're doing is you are setting up a map and you are keying events to different locations on it. Like when the players get here, this is what's going on here. So in a sense, you're not so much setting up a like, when the players get here, this is what happens. It's more, this is what's going on here. You're giving yourself a bunch of tools to play with later in the campaign. So it's really easy to run once you do the setup because you have everything you need in front of you. You know who's where. You know what's going on in X, Y, and Z. I mean, granted, you can make it really complicated and make things depend on like time of day or like have it change as time goes on. Like, well, if they get here in the first month, this is happening. But after December the 127th, the situation changes like this. Just so we're all very clear, when I'm putting in a campaign together, that's my internal dialogue voice right there. That's what it sounds like. Okay, so all that said, I want to show you how I set up a hex crawl campaign. Now, there's plenty of different ways to do it, and I'm sure you can look at other videos and see like some variations here or there. Like the heart of it's the same. There's hexes, things change on hexes, but I'm going to tell you how I set up a hex crawl campaign. So with that, no further ado, let me introduce you to my favorite free map making software, Incarnate. That said, we pay for it at Crumble and Keep because sometimes we like to use it in our books and things like that. But there is definitely a free level of it. So you can... so you can definitely just sign up and start making maps in it without any problem. Okay, let's see. 1 million tabs. We got our Incarnate over here. Alright, so, Incarnate. When you start a new map, it's going to look a lot like this. Ocean. Ocean as far as the eye can see. So the first thing I'm going to do is, since it's a hex crawl campaign, I'm going to set it up with... Anyone? Anyone? Hexes! So you got a little tool here that you can set grids on. Click on Show Grid. It shows its default grid, which is a kind of a slanted, kind of good for things that look... the word is escaping me now. Think of a dungeon where you can see both height and depth and width all at the same time. Isometric. A grid that's kind of good for isometric, but that is not what we want for our purposes. So we're going to go up here and... Oh, great, you can see my arrow. We're going to choose this little hex here, and notice it changes it all to hex. Hexes. So we got a lot of hexes on this page, and this is a little demonstrational video. I ain't trying to make a campaign this big, but you can, is a cool part. Like, you can actually create or increase the amount there to make it bigger or smaller. But right now, we're going to go kind of small, right? So this looks pretty good here. Okay, so we got 12 columns and 9 rows of hexes on the map. Now, I don't want this all to be ocean, so I'm going to come over here to the paintbrush, and let's go kind of jungly island, right? Okay, so that looks like a good texture. And, oh, right. I have to add land first, which I don't have. So we'll go to the shovel and add some land. Yeah, drawing an island. And, you know, you can get as in-depth as you want for this when you're doing it. I don't want you all to watch me flail around and try and make something pretty right now, so we're going quick, right? Okay, so we got our land, then we're going back to the brush. I'm just giving it a quick color in here. This is purely for aesthetics. This has nothing to do with the mechanics of a Hex Crawl campaign. But we got a map. It's got hexes. This is a great first start. So, before I start doing anything more from here, I want to explain some of the mechanics of a Hex Crawl campaign. And again, take what you want from this. Like, you can make it as complicated as you want, right? But for myself, I like to use a good rule of thumb that each hex is around 6 miles. Not that important, but it might come up. What is important is that you can go through about 4 of them a day. Like, when it comes to D&D, I like thinking of the day in terms of, and this is, I've seen other games use this, watches. And there's 6 watches in a day. And this is based off a 24-hour day. If you start getting into different day lengths because of your own campaign world, like, you do the math, okay? So, but in a 24-hour day, we got 6 watches, each watch being 4 hours. So in one watch, you can move from one hex to the next. So that means you can go 4 hexes and still get an 8-hour rest in after moving through them. So when you are designing your map, you want to be thinking about that in terms of how far you want to place things apart. Because in a sense, they're kind of like resources. Like if you only have one town on the map, like one place of safety, once you get past 4 hexes away from that, you know people aren't going to be able to rest in the town, replenish their supplies, etc. So yes, I mentioned supplies. One of the things often used in Hex Crawl games, and again, you don't have to do this if it's not the flavor of your game, but resource management usually comes in pretty big, right? So if you can travel 4 hexes in a day, that means you're going to need rations and water for those 4 days, right? Or I'm sorry, those 4 hexes. So like 1 day's worth of rations gets you through 4 hexes. So you want to think about that when you're traveling. Are you going a long way? Well, maybe you don't know. Ask the people in the local village how far to this. Maybe they know, and they can give you an idea of how many supplies you'll need, right? So, again, that is not everyone's cup of tea. I kind of like it, though, right? So you buy your supplies to go through the hexes. Other things you might need and think about is things like arrows and, like, things you basically deplete as you adventure. Now, one of the reasons this is important, aside from just bookkeeping, which everyone loves bookkeeping, is item depletion becomes part of the game, and that's when towns start to matter so much more. If you run out of something as simple as arrows, it becomes really important where the next town is, right? So yes, that's why all this kind of like distance matters. And you can do away with it or whatnot. And I'm going to tell you other things you can do with the distance. Sorry, there's a truck backing up outside right now. That beeping has nothing to do with hex crawls. But based on that assumption, the first thing I'm going to want to do with my map is I'm going to want to add a village. So I'm going to go over to the stamps over here. Village. And let's go with this nice thing here. I am going to put it on the map by the coast, a nice coastal village. And then once it is picked, I'm going to shrink it down until it fits in that hex. Okay, we know we got a village there. Great. This is probably going to be the starting area of the campaign. So from there, you probably want to decide like what kind of terrain is around your starting village. Now, why that's important. Knowing what terrain is there gives you an idea of what kind of random encounters you might have. I talked a bit ago to DM Dix about random encounters, and we put out a lot of info out there, and I will link to that video, because these 2 videos together are just going to be like really best friends. They're going to do you good, right? Because once you have your hex crawl all done, you're going to want to figure out the possibility of what happens between your major points of interest. Major points of interest being like this village right here, right? What happens when you are between villages, dungeons, etc. Like places where you know things are happening. That's where the element of randomness comes in and kind of makes it fun. Do you run into monsters along the way between the two villages? Do you run into traveling merchants? You get to roll some dice and figure it out. Or maybe draw some playing cards. We talk about that too. But yeah, I will link to that video too, and I will cover it a little bit in here as well. But that video really is the goldmine of random encounters. So we got our starting village. We're going to figure out our surrounding terrain. This village is going to be hedged in by mountains. Okay, gonna shrink that down just a little bit. So we are going, like, our goal isn't necessarily to make this map pretty, it's to make it functional. And why would I say that? Because we're gonna make sure there's just one mountain in each of these hexes. So what that tells us is when the PCs are in one of these hexes, it is mountainous terrain. If we have a random encounter table specifically for mountainous terrain, we're going to roll on that to see what happens when they're, if anything, while they're passing through this area. Other things it could tell us, and again, this is depending on how involved you want to get, mountains, they're hard to pass through, right? You ever climb up a flight of stairs? Imagine doing that forever, because it's a mountain. They could slow things down. So I mentioned before, I like to use the 6-mile hex, 4 hexes you can move per day. You could kind of treat mountains like difficult terrain, right? So going through the mountains, you could only go 2 a day before you would have to rest. So judging from what I just set up right here, if you're in this village and you're going inland, it's going to take you 2 days to get out of the mountainous terrain, right? Okay, so we got a simple little landscape here of mountains. We're going to make some random encounters for those, which again, I'll talk a little bit about later. And we want some more points of interest now. So we are going to take, we're going to take a tent. We are going to put it in this hex right here, blow it up a little bit so it's as big as it can be while it still fits in the hex. Okay, so now we have 2 points of interest that aren't just generic terrain. We have the village up here, and we have the tent down here. Now, for your points of interest, you're going to want to find some way to label them. You could call them by name, you could give them a number, just some way that you can reference them somewhere else. So I'm going to give them numbers. This is going to be number 1. This is going to be number 2. And it's just kind of like keying a dungeon, right? Like, oh, what's in room number 1? What's in room number 2? Same type of story. You're going to look at the number and then look at the key. So number 1, village of Coastlandia. I swear I'm better at names than this, but this is what you're getting right now. And this is where you could write like a quick list of notes for the village of Coastlandia. Headmeister Bumbledoodle is in charge, and she leads with an iron fist. The Thieves Guild here is very active. Right, things like that. So you can start kind of putting together your village and things that the players might run into here. After a bit, I'm going to show you how to get a little more in depth with this, what I like to do for villages, but I don't want to take you away from the main Hex Crawl yet. Okay, so number 2 is our little tent. We're going to make that Rangers Camp. Let's see, what's a good name for a group of Rangers? Rangers of the Wet Dawn. Okay, I said good name, but you're going to get that instead. So, here's where we write the situation in the camp. They are being harassed by a local kobold tribe. Have no love for Headmeister Bumbledoodle. right? So I'm putting a little info on what's going on to the camp. So when the players get there, you could have like a list of important NPCs here they could potentially meet, like anything you think is pertinent, right? And you don't, again, like, if you've watched the random encounter video or you're going to watch it after this, think of it like that. You're going to be setting up situations, not answers, right? Here's what's here, not here's what's going to happen. So you have all these tools when they arrive there. So likely they're going to get there, they're going to talk to the local kobold, or I'm sorry, not talk to local kobold tribes. They're going to talk to the rangers about the local kobold tribe. And so they know now that there is a kobold tribe active, like they're getting information, perhaps other places that they could look for. The rangers might even know where that where the kobold tribe is. So going back here, speaking of, so we just figured out there's a kobold tribe when we were writing that. So let's see, what's a good little stamp to represent that? You know, in truth, you could just write numbers and it would work just as well. But yeah, I like the visual aspect. Okay, so we're going to use this were-rat here, which is not a kobold, but like, it almost looks like a dragon person, right? Okay, so we got that, and we're going to key this at number 3. So many tabs open. If I would have thought about it, I would have closed some. Okay, so number 3. Whoops. Sorry, my backspace loves to stick a little bit. Kobold Marauders. 3d4 kobolds. They are active at night and sleep during the day. 30% chance, half are away on a raid. Have been raiding the Rangers camp to get enough supplies to try and sack the village of Coastlandia. Okay, so we got like a little story there now with, and it is not properly, there we go. We're just gonna properly format this. So we got a little story about the Kobold Marauders now. We know how they relate to the Rangers. We know how they relate to Coastlandia. So we have, yeah, we have the starts of a little adventure here. So now for S and Gs, once you get in past those mountains, it's a jungle, baby. So we're going to get some jungle trees. We are going to make them much smaller than this so they fit. Yeah, relative size, not important. They just need to fit in the hex. So we're going to make trees that are as big as the mountains. And once I size that one, the rest should be good. Clicking trees, clicking trees. So this is going to be our jungle. And this is probably going to be the main area of... We're going to leave that one empty. We want to put something there a little later. The main terrain of the adventure here is going to be this jungle. Okay, so we got a jungle, right? We'll fill it in with just a little more over here. So what this would mean for us is that we would do those random encounters. We would do another set for a jungle. What are they going to possibly find as they're going through the jungle? So random encounters versus our like keyed points. In some ways, they're a lot the same. You're going to write them the same way. Here's what they find, not what happens. The big difference is that our keyed points, they are tied to a location. They are definitely here. Like, the Rangers camp is not going to move. You're not going to find a Rangers camp randomly elsewhere. However, let's think about these Kobold Marauders. Their main camp or whatnot is here, but maybe for a random encounter, we have the players run into a raiding party. And that can make sense in both the mountains and jungle, since they're kind of surrounded by both, right? Or as a random encounter, we could have them run into a ranger out in the wild who could possibly be an ally. Or lizard folk who live in the jungle, or whatever, right? Random encounters are things that won't be tied to a place. Now, I say that, and you can mess with that a little bit. You could, for a random encounter, have they find a cave. And that cave doesn't exist until they find it. And then you can put it on the map to remind yourself it's there. So that's, you can play around with random encounters that way too. But the things that are keyed on the map will always be exactly where they are. So theoretically, at this point, we're going to have 2 random encounter tables and 3 keyed locations. We're probably going to want a few more keyed locations. So we are going to put in another village, because that village that we saw before, that's not the only village on the island. There's going to be this village too. And we are, speaking of caves, here in the midst of the jungle is a rocky outcropping with a cave that goes into it. This is your first dungeon. And your first dungeon, let's see, ends up being 1, 2, 3, 4. A day and a half, at least, I didn't account for mountains, away from your first town. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, and about the same, a little bit farther away from the second town there. Why do I even mention that? Because that's going to play into the supplies. They can't just walk out the dungeon's front door and go get more rations or supplies. They're going to have to travel for a bit. If they're not used to hex crawls, they might not be thinking about that, right? So maybe it's something explained before game. Or you might want to have, we could just as easily take that mountain over there, move the dungeon here. The dungeon is now in the mountains, and they can get back and forth there from one day. So that's not bad for your low-level dungeons, where things are maybe more deadly, and they are more likely to die. So, right, we got to key that too, so we will put 4 on that. And this could be where you write something like C, X, Y, and Z dungeon map, and that's when you go to your dungeon map to see what the dungeon looks like. And then obviously there is a Dark Citadel from times gone past, out in the middle of the jungle. Obviously a lot of snakes, setites, serpent people type of thing, but that could potentially be the second dungeon that your players could find. Live your best life, decide on your own, but there is kind of the old school lore is the farther you get away from your starting town, the more dangerous things become. So on one hand, that's balance. Who needs campaign balance? But on the other hand, that's a way to build it in, right? Same thing with dungeon floors. The deeper you go in a dungeon, the more dangerous they get. So you know that if you're barely alive and you're about to go to your next floor, maybe it's time to go back to town and rest up in the relative safety of there. Get your spells back, replenish supplies, try it again. And if you make it a requirement to level up in towns, well, even more so. And then on the southern part of this island, we're going to create a little swamp. So this would be our third set of random encounters. We would then be making one for the swamp as well. If you just have one terrain type, you could potentially have just one type of random encounters. Or you could even get more specific, like if you have a very large map, you could have just mountain random encounters, or you could have the Broken Tooth Mountain Range random encounters, which are your mountains on the west coast, and your Jagged Horn Mountain Range, your mountains on the east coast. And you could base those random encounters around what's around that area. Fun thing about that, it's more in depth, the world feels more alive. It's also more work, right? So, like, try not to bite off more than you're going to chew, you know? So, we have 6 encounters on this, or 6 keyed locations on this map. Oh, 7, I forgot this village over here. There's no steadfast rule about how many you want to have. You do likely want to leave room for random encounters, so you don't want to pack things too closely. But really, that's your guiding principle: is how far away from things do you want people to be? How much overland travel do you want them to have? So, random encounter wise. For each area, each zone, you want to decide how dangerous it is, how likely they are to have a random encounter. And if you go into the random encounter video again, it's going to go more in depth than this and say different ways you can do this. I'm just going to give you a simple one right here, right? Decide on how many chances in a 1d6 roll they're going to have a random encounter. Maybe close to the village up here, it's not that dangerous. They're only going to run into a random encounter on a 1 in 6 chance. So statistically speaking, for every 6 hexes they go through, they're going to have 1 random encounter that you're going to then roll on your table of random encounters for. Maybe the jungle's more dangerous, so we're going to go 3 in 6. So that's going to give them a 50-50 chance of having a random encounter. So almost every other hex, they're going to have an encounter. Then let's say the the swamp is just a terrifying place full of giant snakes and hags and terrible things. No one wants to go there. Not a place you want to vacation. Let's say 5 and 6. So chances are every hex you're going to go through is going to be something. When players are traveling through a land, they're going to get that kind of vibe real quick of how dangerous it is, as they're either traveling through multiple hexes at a clip, or they move a hex, and every hex they move through, there's a new encounter. So, procedural-wise, what you're going to do, they're starting out to town, they do all their, beginning stuff, yada yada, they're ready to go out in the world. Pardon, you're going to ask them where they want to go. Maybe you give them a copy of this map, maybe you don't. Maybe the area isn't well known, in which case they'd have to choose a direction they walk, as opposed to, we want to head toward this. And even if they want to head toward X, Y, or Z, get them to tell you what route they want to take to get there. From what hex to what hex. Anyway, they're in a village. They decide they want to go south. So we're going to use that 1 in 6, I said, around a village. So you're going to roll a d6 dice, see if you roll a 1. If you don't, great, they get into this hex. They get to decide where they go next. You repeat it again. Until they roll a random encounter. So if they move into a hex and they roll for a random encounter, then you roll on the table of random encounters you have and you see what happens. And then you play it out, right? So you always kind of know, you never know what's going to happen, really, but you kind of do, as in you have the tools to use. You were kind to yourself and you gave yourself all these tools before you ever started the game, right? So you're just going to roll and get to see when you use them. So then when they get to a keyed location, you can run it the same way you run a random encounter, except you know something's happening there. So you can just go right to that and go right to your list of keyed locations and what's going on there, right? Okay, so I got 2 kind of bonuses for you here. That was the basis of a hex crawl. There's so much more you get onto it, but that's the meat and potatoes, and that's what you want. I actually kind of wanted to revisit this because I've been working on my my mini hex crawl, Deep Dark Wood, which is available on our website. There is a chat in the comments area, or a description rather. Yeah, I've been working on kind of another supplement to kind of bulk that out again. So what that is it's a series of 7 locations, 7 different hexes that you could easily just run as is, or you can make a larger map like this and insert them where you will. And I've been working on some random encounters for it as well to kind of flesh that out and give it more of a... There's a very specific, kind of dark fairy tale-ish feel to it. And I wanted to elaborate more on some of the hooks that I have in there, because it's a lot of hooks. It's only 7 locations, but each one is a hook in and of itself, right? I was going somewhere with all that, other than just tooting my own horn. Right, so first bonus is I want to give you a little bit of advice. This can seem really daunting. I have to write up descriptions for 6 locations and make 3 different random encounter tables, and this is just a small area. How am I going to get all that done? Here's the cool thing. You don't. You can pretty much assume that your players are not going to get all the way from that starting village all the way down to number 6, right? You don't have to worry about what's at number 6 right now. If you have the time, or you already know in your heart of hearts what's there, cool, write it down. But you don't have to know, right? So you're going to start with your starting village, figure out what's there, figure out what's about. Maybe you have some cool ideas in your head of notes you want to take down, like there's a band of ogres somewhere on this island that's terrorizing the whole thing, or the dark goddess has returned and her worshippers are forming a cult on this island to hasten her regaining her powers to destroy the world, you know. So like you can have the big overarching campaign idea you might usually have, and that's a cool thing to have, but you just get to explain it geographically. So that said, even if you have that big idea, you're going to start with your starting village, and then you're going to figure out what's around it. So you're going to make that starting village. Then, since we know there's mountains here, you're going to write your random encounters for the mountains. And then, since we know there's the dungeons and the kobolds real close, we can make the story for those and flesh those out. And maybe even, the camp here, just because those things are all really close. So if they're in the village, like, they're likely not going to know where to go. The villagers will know rumors. There will be talk in the local tavern and whatnot. Heck, you could even go, like, old school, like, well, there's a quest board in town with bounties posted on it and different adventures you can take. And, like, the bonus of that, the reason that was done is it streamlines what you have to worry about right now. If they know about the kobolds, but they don't know about the Dark Tower off in the jungle, they're going to go for the kobolds. They might just start wandering about randomly, and thankfully you have random encounters keyed for that. Like, I know I said it's impossible to go off the rails, and in a way it is. Like, if you get all of this done up front, there's nowhere they can go that you don't have planned for. But if they do, like, you may have to go on the fly, and that's probably not new for you. You've DM'd before. But the longer you work on this campaign from week to week, the less chance that there is that that's going to happen. Like, at the first week or so, you're going to do more than you need. You're going to have more locations than they're possibly going to get to. And that's a good thing. They're going to go to one location, and some of your others might feel wasted. But they'll happen in the future. Or maybe they won't, and that's also kind of okay too, right? And then the next week when you sit down to do your campaign prep, you get maybe your next set of random encounter tables done. You do a few more locations. So even if you are starting at a map that, like, you know, is more like this in terms of hexes as opposed to this, you don't have to have them all up front. You can start a huge campaign and you just work on it from week to week. You just need to know what's in the area where you are. And at the end of every week, you'll know where the players are and where they've been. So, like, if they get to this cave and that's where they end, you'll either know that there's more dungeon they're going to go into, or you can start working on, like, okay, what's around the cave that I need to do? And you can start keying these hexes a few at a time. So that's how you're going to not drive yourself crazy in doing these little hex crawls. Okay, kind of save this real quick. So, the other bonus. One of my big theories about game design is that if you give players a tool, they're gonna use it, right? So, like, you kind of control the flow of tools and information is a tool, to them. And people who looked really hard at that page right now may have gotten an idea of some of my upcoming projects. Don't say anything. So, on that note, given players tools, then they're going to use tools. We have our beginning city of Coastlandia, right? Okay, so that's where the adventure is starting. What are the players going to do there? So, just going to start a little map here right quick. Like, why does Coastlandia matter. So another way you can kind of narrow the field is you can treat Coastlandia kind of like you do the Hex Crawl. And by that I mean, in some ways, it can be a mini Hex Crawl in and of itself, right? So let's make these a little smaller so we can, I like to usually use like 50%. Okay, so we're just gonna really crowd the city here. We're just gonna paint some houses. And this is, we're basically right now, we're making a map of Coastlandia that the players are going to get to see. So I like to use like a kind of backdrop of like, oh, all these houses kind of look the same. And then for the kind of special things, like basically we're making points of interest right now, just like we would if we were doing the Overland Hex Crawl, right? So I'm just throwing a few stamps out there to kind of give you all an idea. Let's put a festering pit in here. Why not? Okay, so we got a few things, and then we're going to key them. These I like to key with names, because this is a map I like to show to players when they get to town. And just seeing these places, the Burning Lantern, obviously an inn, right? So we got the Burning Lantern, the Evertree, the Pit of Eternal Despair. Every urban planner makes sure there's one there. The Docks. Okay, so by making these locations, keying them with names, you're planting seeds in their head, right? So you start to adventure, you show them this map, they see this, they're gonna be like, okay, well, let's go to Burning Lantern and see if we can't get some rumors or get some information about what's going on, or just try and get drunk, because for some reason people love to do that in D&D games. Or we're gonna go to the docks and see what the workers are doing down there. The Pit of Eternal Despair, the Evertree. What the hell are those? We should check those out. We need to know what the hell those are. They're gonna say that. Why that's important. They're not gonna say, I want to go to this house right here. You know what I mean? So in a way, you're keying locations just like you did in the Hex Crawl, and you're giving the players places to go and things to check out. Like, after a while, if they are like, I want to go to this house, I want to go to this house, someone just lives there, it's boring, you'll train them. They'll get the hint that, like, I don't have a good reason to go there. There's nothing there. The important things are listed on the map. The DM isn't trying to hide anything from me. And you can key all these locations. You can even make random encounters just for the city if you want. But you don't have to. Normally, like, you know, think about the kind of random encounters you'd have in a city. Maybe there's ruffians, but I like a lot more non-combat encounters in the city. You can make a rumors table at the Burning Lantern. Roll 1d12. Oh, I rolled a 2. This drunk person wants to tell them about the Dark Citadel out in the jungle, or whatever, right? And you can change that table based on what you want them to know at any given time. So that's tip 2. That's what I like to do for my villages, which is just kind of like an extension of the overall Hex Crawl aesthetic. You can also, in Incarnate, new map. I actually don't want to save this one. I have no reason to save this one. Yeah, saving canceled. That's right. Let's see here. Where's a good example of... Oh, you know where it is. So one of the other things I like to do in Incarnate is go into the battle maps and, you know, for the dungeon type locations that they can get to. Because I run a lot of my games on Roll20, right? So that's a large portion of why this works, this particular thing works for me, is I'll actually plot out the dungeons in here as well and upload those maps. So if they go to dungeon whatever, it's already there, and I can just transfer them into a new map. I'll already have the monsters on it and everything. So everything seems a little seamless. And again, you always know what's everywhere. Like, they're never catching you with your pants down, right? And if they do, it's not a big deal. you'll just know next week, have a better idea of where they're heading. You can even, at the end of each session, or like as you're getting ready to do your campaign prep for the week, start a group chat. Ask them where they want to start heading, where they want to go. Make them commit to that before the game. And then you can make sure you have that area figured out already. There's no need to make it harder on yourself than it already is. DMing's a lot, right? And prep can take up a lot. I like hex crawls both because they're so comprehensive, but also because they narrow the focus of what you have to do at any given time. It seems big and overwhelming, but it's really quite achievable as long as you do it right. You communicate with your players, and you kind of design with that in mind, that it's not going to all be done yet, and that you'll have to make more in the future, right? And after a few sessions of doing this, you're going to get even better at it, because you're going to get a better idea of how far your players are going to go in a given session. How many dungeon floors they might clear, how many hexes they might move through, right? Like, it's going to start becoming a lot more intuitive. Like, it's hard to pace that story at first because you don't know what your game's going to feel like. Also, just know that the more random encounters in an area, the slower they're going to move through it. So you're just going to, like, you're going to start to sense that balance of things, of how many random encounters you need in an area to, like, mark their progress, how fast they're going to move through things. So, like, mastering the basics, it's easy, and it's going to get you a long way. You're going to be able to use this from day one that you start making hex crawls. You're going to be able to use this from day one when you start making hex crawls, right? Spend an hour, you got your campaign start. But you're just going to get better at it as you go. Every week, you're going to get better at it. Your ideas are going to get better. You're going to have more lore and ideas to build on every single week. And the cool thing about that lore is your players are going to discover it, in a sense, like, as you do, because it's going to be geographically based. So it's all very gameable. And that's the type of lore that players care about. It's going to factor into what they are doing. And so they're going to be more excited to learn it. To know, like, oh, the kobolds have been terrorizing this area for years and they're over here. That's going to be really important for them. And granted, you can make that deeper. Because they're worshipping this dragon that lives in the south, or because they're awaiting the return of the Dracolich that lived here in the dawn of yada yada, right? And we could talk about more advanced techniques about, like, tracking time and weather and things like that. We're not going to today. You just bit off a lot. But if you would like to hear about tracking time and weather and whatnot, I'd be happy to do another one of these in the future. Truth be told, I did not pour myself water before I started, and I'm kind of thirsty, right? But if you want to hear more, let me know. If there's interest, I'll talk more about it. If you have questions, post. I'll be happy to answer the questions. And if the questions are big enough, I'll do another video. Yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. And this has been your Hex Crawl A-Go-Go. Again, I hope it was helpful. And if you are interested in these things and you kind of want to see some sample locations and whatnot, or, like, you're just like, wow, James is really cool, I want to support what he does, go check out Deep Dark Woods. Look for the link in the comments or the description. Yeah, and get yourself some Deep Dark Wood. It's available in print and digital. It's pretty cheap, little zine, and I'm going to go back to working on the random encounters for it. You're all great. Have a wonderful rest of your life, and I'll see you again soon.